been a while. Check. What are you watching? Check. The audio is so bad in here. The acoustics are so bad. So bad. Wait a minute. That's right, Mike. Alrighty. Been a while. So I finished reading Representative Men. Took a little detour from the essential writings of to read the other essays he had. So I really liked that series that he did. But for the sake of sort of completion, I'm going to read English Traits now. It doesn't really interest me all that much. It's over 100 pages. But after that, we get back more into like general category essays. Then all of his poems, which I don't know if I want to read, but after his poems, there's more sort of essays about particular things, like proper noun, people, fugitive slave law, Emancipation Proclamation, and then people, emancipation in the British West Indies. It's interesting stuff I'd like to read. I mean, the poems might be okay. I'll just be reading poetry for like 685 to 743. Alright. Alright, I think I'm just going to read, 20 pages, I think. Which is going to take a while. Chapter 1, 2, and 3, I think. Chapter 1, First Visit to England. Chapter 2, Voyage to England. And Chapter 3, Land. This is a long chapter. Well, not really. Just 20 pages in total. Usually takes me like 90 minutes, I think. Alrighty, English Traits, Chapter 1, First Visit to England. I have been twice to England. In 1833, on my return from a short tour in Sicily, Italy, and France, I crossed from Bologna and landed in London. At the Tower Stairs, it was a dark Sunday morning. There were few people in the streets, and I remember the pleasure of that first walk on English ground, which my companion, an American artist, from the Tower up through Cheapside and the Strand to a house in Russell Square, whither whither we had been recommended to good chambers For the first time for many months, we were forced to check the saucy habit of travelers' criticism, as we could no longer speak aloud in the streets without being understood. The shop signs spoke our language. Our country names were on the door plates, and the public and private buildings wore a more native and wonted front. Like most young men at that time, I was much indebted to the men of Edinburgh and of the Edinburgh Review, to Geoffrey, Mackintosh, Hallam, and to Scott, Playfair, and De Quincey, and my narrow and desultory reading had inspired the wish to see the faces of 3 or 4 writers: Coleridge, Wordsworth, Landor, De Quincey, and the latest and strongest contributor to the critical journals, Carlyle. And I suppose if I had sifted the reasons that led me to Europe when I was ill and was advised to travel, it was mainly the attraction of these persons. If Goethe had been still living, I might have wandered into Germany also. Besides those I have named, for Scott was dead, there was not in Britain the man living whom I cared to behold, unless it were the Duke of Wellington, whom I afterwards saw at Westminster Abbey at the funeral of Wilberforce. The young scholar fancies it happiness enough to live with people who can give an insight to the world, without reflecting that they are prisoners, too, of their own thought, and cannot apply themselves to yours. The conditions of literary success are almost destructive of the best social power, as they do not leave that frolic liberty which only can encounter a companion on the best terms. It is probable you left some obscure comrade at a tavern or in the farms with right mother wit and equality to life when he crossed sea and land to play bo-peep with celebrated scribes. I have, however, found writers superior to their books, and I cling to my first belief that a strong head will dispose fast enough of these impediments and give one the satisfaction of reality, the sense of having been met, and a larger horizon. On looking over the diary of my journey in 1833, I find nothing to publish in my memoranda of visits to places, but I have copied the few notes I made of visits to persons, as they respect parties quite too good and too transparent to the whole world to make it needful to affect any prudery of suppression about a few hints of those bright personalities. At Florence, chief among artists, I found Horatio Greenough, the American sculptor. His face was so handsome and his person so well formed that he might be pardoned if, as was alleged, the face of his Medora and the figure of a colossal Achilles in clay were idealizations of his own. Greenough was a superior man, ardent and eloquent, and all his opinions had elevation and magnanimity. He believed that the Greeks had wrought in schools or fraternities the genius of the master, imparting his design to his friends and inflaming them with it. And when his strength was spent, a new hand with equal heat continued to work. And so by relays until it was finished in every part with equal fire. This was necessary in so refractory a material as stone, and he thought art would never prosper until we left our shy, jealous ways and worked in society as they. All his thoughts breathed the same generosity. He was an accurate and a deep man. He was a votary of the Greeks and impatient of Gothic art. His paper on architecture, published in 1843, announced in advance the leading thoughts of Mr. Ruskin on the morality in architecture, notwithstanding the antagonism in their views of the history of art. I have a private letter from him later, but respecting the same period, in which he roughly sketches his own theory. Here is my theory of structure, a scientific arrangement of spaces and forms to functions and to sight, an emphasis of features proportioned to their gradated importance in function, color and ornament to be decided and arranged and varied by strictly organic laws, having a distinct reason for each decision, the entire and immediate banishment of all makeshift and make-believe. Greenough brought me, through a common friend, an invitation from Mr. Lander, who lived at Santa Monica di Fiesole. On the 15th of May, I dined with Mr. Landor. I found him noble and courteous, living in a cloud of pictures at his Villa Gherardisa, a fine house commanding a beautiful landscape. I had inferred from his books, or magnified from some anecdotes, an impression of Achillean wrath and untamable petulance. I do not know whether the imputation were just or not, but certainly on this May day his courtesy veiled that haughty mind, and he was the most patient and gentle of hosts. He praised the beautiful cyclamen which grows all about Florence. He admired Washington, talked of Wordsworth, Byron, Massinger, Beaumont, and Fletcher. To be sure, he is decided in his opinions, likes to surprise, and is well content to impress, if possible, his English whim upon the immutable past. No great man ever had a great son, if Philip and Alexander be not an exception, and Philip he calls the greater man. In art, he loves the Greeks, and in sculpture, them only. He prefers the Venus to everything else, and after that the head of Alexander in the gallery here. He prefers John of Bologna to Michelangelo, in painting Raphael, and shares the growing taste for Perugino and the early masters. The Greek historians he thought the only good, and after them Voltaire's. I could not make him praise Mackintosh, nor my more recent friends. Montaigne very cordially, and Charon also, which seemed undiscriminating. He thought De Gerando indebted to Lucas on happiness and Lucas on holiness. He pestered me with Southey. But who is Southey? He invited me to breakfast on Friday. On Friday I did not fail to go, and this time with Greenough. He entertained us at once with criticizing half a dozen hexameter lines of Julius Caesar's. From Donatus, he said, he glorified Lord Chesterfield more than was necessary and undervalued Burke. And undervalued Socrates. Designated as three of the greatest men Washington, Phocion, and Timoleon, much as our pomologists in their lists select the 3 or the 6 best pears for a small orchard, and did not even omit to remark the similar termination of their names. A great man, he said, should make great sacrifices and kill his 100 oxen without knowing whether they would be consumed by gods and heroes, or whether the flies would eat them. I had visited Professor Amici, who had shown me his microscopes, magnifying, it was said, 2,000 diameters, and I spoke of the uses to which they were applied. Landor despised etymology, yet in the same breath said the sublime was in a grain of dust. I suppose I teased him about recent writers, but he professed never to have heard of Herschel, not even by name. One room was full of pictures which he likes to show, especially one piece, standing before which he said he would give 50 guineas to the man that would swear it was a Domenicino. I was more curious to see his library, but Mr. H., one of the guests, told me that Mr. Landor gives away his books and has never more than a dozen at a time in his house. Mr. Landor carries to its height the love of freak, which the English delight to indulge, as if to signalize their commanding freedom. He has a wonderful brain, despotic, violent, and inexhaustible, meant for a soldier, by what chance converted to letters, in which there is not a style nor a tint not known to him, yet with an English appetite for action and heroes. The thing done avails, and not what is said about it. An original sentence, a step forward, is worth more than all the censures. Landor is strangely undervalued in England, usually ignored and sometimes savagely attacked in the reviews. The criticism may be right or wrong and is quickly forgotten, but year after year the scholar must still go back to Landor for a multitude of elegant sentences, for wisdom, wit, and indignation that are unforgettable. From London on the 5th August I went to Highgate and wrote a note to Mr. Coleridge requesting leave to pay my respects to him. It was near noon. Mr. Coleridge sent a verbal message that he was in bed, but if I would call him after 1 o'clock, he would see me. I returned at 1, and he appeared, a short, thick, old man, with bright blue eyes and fine, clear complexion, leaning on his cane. He took snuff freely, which presently soiled the cravat and neat black suit. He asked whether I knew Alston, and spoke warmly of his merits and doings when he knew him in Rome, what a master of the Titanesque he was, etc., etc. He spoke of Dr. Channing. It was an unspeakable misfortune that he should have turned out a Unitarian after all. On this he burst into a declamation on the folly and ignorance of Unitarianism, its high unreasonableness, and taking up Bishop Waterland's book, which lay on the table, he read with vehemence 2 or 3 pages written by himself in the fly-leaves, passages too, which, I believe, are printed in the Aids to Reflection. When he stopped to take a breath, I interposed that, whilst I highly valued all his explanations, I was bound to tell him that I was born and bred a Unitarian. Yes, he said, I suppose so. and continued as before. It's a wonder that after so many ages of unquestioning acquiescence in the doctrine of St. Paul, the doctrine of the Trinity, which was also, according to Philo Judaeus, the doctrine of the Jews before Christ, this handful of priestlians should take on themselves to deny it, etc., etc. He was very sorry that Dr. Channing, a man to whom he looked up, no, to say that he looked up to him would be to speak falsely, but a man whom he looked at with so much interest should embrace such views. When he saw Dr. Channing, he had hinted to him that he was afraid he loved Christianity for what was lovely and excellent. He loved the good in it, and not the true. And I tell you, sir, that I have known 10 persons who loved the good for one person who loved the true. But it is a far greater virtue to love the true for itself alone than to love the good for itself alone. He, Coleridge, knew all about Unitarianism perfectly well because he had once been a Unitarian and knew that what quackery it was. He had been called, quote, the rising star of Unitarianism. He went on defining, or rather refining, quote, the Trinitarian doctrine was realism. The idea of God was not essential but superessential. Talked of trinism and tetrachism and much more, of which I only caught this, quote, that the will was that by which a person is a person, because if one should push me in the street, and so I should force the man next to me into the kennel, I should at once exclaim, I did not do it, sir, meaning it was not my will. And this also, quote, if you should insist on your faith here in England, and I on mine, would be the hotter side of the faggot. I took advantage of a pause to say that he had many readers of all religious opinions in America, and I proceeded to inquire if the, quote, extract from the Independence pamphlet in the 3rd volume of The Friend was a veritable quotation. He replied that it was really taken from a pamphlet in his possession entitled, quote, a protest of one of the Independents, or something to that effect. I told him how excellent I thought it, and how much I wished to see the entire work. Yes, he said, the man was a chaos of truths, but lacked the knowledge that God was a God of order. Yet the passage would no doubt strike you more in the quotation than in the original, for I have filtered it. When I rose to go, he said, I do not know whether you care about poetry, but I will repeat some verses I had lately made on my baptismal anniversary. And he recited with strong emphasis, standing 10 or 12 lines beginning, Born unto God in Christ. He inquired where I had been traveling, and on learning that I had been in Malta and Sicily, he compared one island with the other, repeating what he had said to the Bishop of London when he returned from that country, that Sicily was an excellent school of political economy. For in any town there, it only needed to ask what the government enacted, and reverse that, to know what ought to be done. It was the most felicitously opposite legislation to anything good and wise. There were only 3 things which the government had brought into that garden of delights, namely, itch, pox, and famine. Whereas in Malta, the force of law and mind was seen in making that barren rock of semi-Saracen inhabitants the seat of population and plenty. Going out, he showed me in the next apartment a picture of Alston's and told me that Montaigne, or Montague, a picture dealer, once came to see him, and glancing towards this, he said, quote, "Well, you have got a picture," thinking it the work of an old master. Afterwards, Montague, still talking with his back to the canvas, put up his hand and touched it, and exclaimed, "By heaven, this picture is not 10 years old." So delicate and skillful was that man's touch. I was in his company for about an hour, but find it impossible to recall the largest part of his discourse, which was often like so many printed paragraphs in his book, perhaps the same. So readily did he fall into certain commonplaces. As I might have foreseen, the visit was rather a spectacle than a conversation. Of no use beyond the satisfaction of my curiosity. He was old and preoccupied, and could not bend to a new companion and think with him. From Edinburgh, I went to the Highlands. On my return, I came from Glasgow to Dumfries, and being intent on delivering a letter which I had brought from Rome, inquired for Craigen Puttock. Craigen Puttock. It was a farm in Nithsdale, in the parish of Dunscore, 16 miles distant. I love those easy to pronounce English names. No public coach passed near it, so I took a private carriage from the inn. I found the house amid desolate, heathery hills, where the lonely scholar nourished his mighty heart. Carlyle was a man from his youth, an author who did not need to hide from his readers, and as absolute a man of the world, unknown and exiled on that hill farm, as if holding on his own terms what is best in London. He was tall and gaunt, with a cliff-like brow, self-possessed, and holding his extraordinary powers of conversation in easy command, clinging to his northern accent with evident relish, full of lively anecdote, and with a streaming humor which floated everything he looked upon. His talk, playfully exalting the familiar objects, put the companion at once into an acquaintance with his lars and lemurs, and it was very pleasant to learn what was predestined to be a pretty mythology. Few were the objects, and lonely the man. Quote, "Not a person to speak to within 16 miles, except the minister of Dunscore," so that books inevitably made his topics. He had names of his own for all the matters familiar to his discourse. Blackwood's was the Sand magazine. Fraser's nearer approach to possibility of life was the Mud magazine. A piece of road nearby that marked some failed enterprise was the, quote, "grave of the last sixpence." When too much praise of any genius annoyed him, he professed hugely to admire the talent shown by his pig. He had spent much time and contrivance in confining the poor beast to one enclosure in his pen. But Pig, by great strokes of judgment, had found out how to let a board down, and had foiled him. For all that he still thought man the most plastic little fellow in the planet, and he liked Nero's death, quote, "qualis artifex perio," better than most history. He worships a man that will manifest any truth to him. At one time he had inquired and read a good deal about America. Landor's principle was mere rebellion, and that, he feared, was the American principle. The best thing he knew of that country was that in it a man can have meat for his labor. He had read in Stewart's book that when he inquired in a New York hotel for the boots, he had been shown across the street and had found Mungo in his own house, dining on roast turkey. We talked of books. Plato does not read, and he disparaged Socrates, and when pressed, persisted in making Mirabeau a hero. Gibbon he called the splendid bridge from the old world to the new. His own reading had been multifarious. Tristram's Shandy was one of his first books after Robinson Crusoe, and Robertson's America an early favorite. Rousseau's Confessions had discovered to him that he was not a dunce, and it was now 10 years since he had learned German by the advice of a man who told him he would find in that language what he wanted. He took despairing or satirical views of literature at this moment, recounted the incredible sums paid in 1 year by the great booksellers for puffing. Hence it comes that no newspaper is trusted now, no books are bought, and the booksellers are on the eve of bankruptcy. He still returned to English pauperism, the crowded country, the selfish abdication by public men of all that public persons should perform. Government should direct poor men what to do. Poor Irish folk come wandering over these moors. My dame makes it a rule to give every son of Adam bread to eat, and supplies his wants to the next house. But here are thousands of acres which might give them all meat, and nobody to bid these poor Irish go to the moor and till it. They burned the stacks, and so found a way to force the rich people to attend to them. We went out to walk over long hills, and looked at Criffel. Then without his cap, and down into Wordsworth's country. There we sat down and talked of the immortality of the soul. It was not Carlyle's fault that we talked on that topic, for he had the natural disinclination of every nimble spirit to bruise itself against walls, and did not like to place himself where no step can be taken. But he was honest and true, and cognizant of the subtle links that bind ages together, and saw how every event affects all the future. Christ died on the tree that built Dunscore Kirk yonder, that brought you and me together. Time has only a relative existence. He was already turning his eyes towards London with a scholar's appreciation. London is the heart of the world, he said, wonderful only from the mass of human beings. He liked the huge machine. Each keeps its own round. The baker's boy brings muffins to the window at a fixed hour every day, and that is all the Londoner knows or wishes to know on the subject. But it turned out good men. He named certain individuals, especially one man of letters, his friend, the best mind he knew, whom London had well served. On the 28th August, I went to Riddle Mount to pay my respects to Mr. Wordsworth. His daughters called in their father, a plain, elderly, white-haired man, not prepossessing, and disfigured by green goggles. He sat down and talked with great simplicity. He had just returned from a journey. His health was good, but he had broken a tooth by a fall. when walking with two lawyers, and had said that he was glad it did not happen 40 years ago, whereupon they had praised his philosophy. He had much to say of America, the more that it gave occasion for his favorite topic, that society is being enlightened by a superficial tuition, out of all proportion to its being restrained by moral culture. Schools do no good. Tuition is not education. He thinks more of the education of circumstances than of tuition. Does not question whether there are offenses of which the law takes cognizance, but whether there are offenses of which the law does not take cognizance. Sin is what he fears, and how society is to escape without gravest mischiefs from this source. He has even said, what seemed a paradox, that they needed a civil war in America to teach the necessity of knitting the social ties stronger. There may be, he said, in America some vulgarity in manner, but that's not important. That comes of the pioneer state of things. But I fear they are too much given to the making of money, and secondly, to politics, that they make political distinction the end and not the means. And I fear they lack a class of men of leisure, in short, of gentlemen, to give a tone of honor to the community. I am told that things are boasted of in the second class of society there, which in England, God knows, are done in England every day, but would never be spoken of. In America, I wish to know not how many churches or schools, but what newspapers. My friend Colonel Hamilton at the foot of the hill, who was a year in America, assures me that the newspapers are atrocious, and accuse members of Congress of stealing spoons. He was against taking off the tax on newspapers in England, which the reformers represent as a tax upon knowledge, for this reason, that they would be inundated with base prints. He said he talked on political aspects, for he wished to impress on me and all good Americans to cultivate the moral, the conservative, etc., etc., and never to call into action the physical strength of the people, as had just now been done in England in the Reform Bill, a thing prophesied by Delolme. He alluded once or twice to his conversation with Dr. Channing, who had recently visited him, laying his hand on a particular chair in which the doctor had sat. The conversation turned on books. Lucretius he esteems a far higher poet than Virgil, not in his system, which is nothing, but in his power of illustration. Faith is necessary to explain anything and to reconcile the foreknowledge of God with human evil. Of Cousin, whose lectures we had all been reading in Boston, he knew only the name. I inquired if he had read Carlyle's critical articles and translations. He said he thought him sometimes insane. He proceeded to abuse Goethe's Wilhelm Meister heartily. It was full of all manner of fornication. It was like the crossing of flies in the air. He had never gone farther than the first part. So disgusted was he that he threw the book across the room. I deprecated this wrath and said what I could for the better parts of the book, and he courteously promised to look at it again. Carlyle, he said, wrote most obscurely. He was clever and deep, but he defied the sympathies of everybody. Even Mr. Coleridge wrote more clearly, though he had always wished Coleridge would write more to be understood. He let me out into his garden and showed me the gravel walk in which thousands of his lines were composed. His eyes are much inflamed. This is no less except for reading, because he never writes prose, and of poetry he carries even hundreds of lines in his head before writing them. He had just returned from a visit to Staffa, and within 3 days he had made 3 sonnets on Fingal's Cave, and was composing a 4th when he was called in to see me. He said, "If you are interested in my verses, perhaps you will like to hear these lines." I gladly assented, and he recollected himself for a few moments, and then stood forth and repeated, one after the other, the 3 entire sonnets with great animation. I fancied the 2nd and 3rd more beautiful than his poems are wont to be. The 3rd is addressed to the flowers, which he said, especially the ox-eye daisy, are very abundant on the top of the rock. The 2nd alludes to the name of the cave, which is Cave of Music. The 1st to the circumstance of its being visited by the promiscuous company of the steamboat. This recitation was so unlooked for and surprising. He, the old Wordsworth, standing apart and reciting to me in a garden walk, like a schoolboy, declaiming, that I at first was near to laugh, but recollecting myself, that I had come thus far to see a poet, and he was chanting poems to me, I saw that he was right and I was wrong, and gladly gave myself up to hear. I told him how much the few printed extracts had quickened the desire to possess his unpublished poems. He replied he never was in haste to publish, partly because he corrected a good deal, and every alteration is ungraciously received after printing, but what he had written would be printed, whether he lived or died. I said Tintern Abbey appeared to be the favorite poem with the public, but more contemplative readers preferred the first books of the Excursion and the Sonnets. He said, quote, "Yes, they are better." He preferred such of his poems as touched the affections to any others. For whatever is didactic, what theories of society and so on might perish quickly, but whatever combined a truth with an affection was good today and good forever. Some alien-looking language. A few words. He cited the sonnet on the feelings of a high-minded Spaniard, which he preferred to any other. I so understood him. And the 2 voices, and quoted with evident pleasure the verses addressed to the skylark. In this connection, he said of the Newtonian theory that it might yet be superseded and forgotten, and Dalton's atomic theory. When I prepared to depart, he said he wished to show me what a common person in England could do, and he led me to the enclosure of his clerk, a young man to whom he had given this slip of ground, which was laid out, or its natural capabilities shown, with much taste. He then said he would show me a better way to walk towards the inn, and he walked a good part of a mile, talking and ever and anon stopping short to impress the word or the verse, and finally parted from me with great kindness and returned across the fields. Wordsworth honored himself by his simple adherence to truth, and was very willing not to shine, but he surprised by the hard limits of his thought. To judge from a single conversation, he made the impression of a narrow and very English mind, of one who paid for his rare elevation by general tameness and conformity. Off his own beat, his opinions were of no value. It is not very rare to find persons loving sympathy and ease who expiate their departure from the common in one direction, by their conformity in every other. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Voyage to England. The occasion of my second visit to England was an invitation from some mechanics institute in Lancashire and Yorkshire, which separately are organized much in the same way as our New England lyceums, but in 1847 had been linked into a union which embraced 20 or 30 towns and cities, and presently extended into the middle counties and northward into Scotland. I was invited on liberal terms to read a series of lectures in them all. The request was urged with every kind suggestion and every assurance of aid and comfort by friendliest parties in Manchester, who in the sequel amply redeemed their word. The remuneration was equivalent to the fees at that time paid in this country for the like services. At all events, it was sufficient to cover any traveling expenses, and the proposal offered an excellent opportunity of seeing the interior of England and Scotland by means of a home and a committee of intelligent friends awaiting me in every town. I did not go very willingly. I am not a good traveler, nor have I found that long journeys yield a fair share of reasonable hours. But the invitation was repeated and pressed at a moment of more leisure, and when I was a little spent by some unusual studies. I wanted a change and a tonic, and England was proposed to me. Besides, there were at least the dread attraction and salutary influences of the sea. So I took my berth in the packet ship Washington Irving and sailed from Boston Tuesday, October 5th, 1847. On Friday at noon, we had only made 134 miles. A nimble Indian would have swum as far. But the captain affirmed that the ship would show us in time all her paces. And we crept along through the floating drift of boards, logs, and chips, which the rivers of Maine and New Brunswick pour into the sea after a freshet. At last, on Sunday, after doing one day's work in 4, the storm came, the winds blew, and we flew before a northwester, which strained every rope and sail. The good ship darts through the water all day, all night, like a fish, quivering with speed, gliding through liquid leagues, sliding from horizon to horizon. She has passed Cape Sable. She has reached the banks. The land birds are left. Gulls, haglets, ducks. Petrels swim, dive, and hover around. No fishermen. She has passed the banks, left 5 sails behind her far on the edge of the west at sundown, which were far east of us at morn. Though they say at sea a stern chase is a long race, and still we fly for our lives. The shortest sea line from Boston to Liverpool is 2,850 miles. This a steamer keeps and saves 150 miles. A sailing ship can never go in a shorter line than 3,000, and usually it is much longer. Our good master keeps his kites up to the last moment, studding sails alow and aloft, and by incessant straight steering never loses a rod of way. Watchfulness is the law of the ship. Watch on watch, for advantage and for life. Since the ship was built, it seems, the master never slept, but in his day clothes whilst on board. There are many advantages, says Sadie, in sea voyaging, but security is not one of them. Yet in hurrying over these abysses, whatever dangers we are running into, we are certainly running out of the risks of hundreds of miles every day, which have their own chances of squall, collision, sea stroke, piracy, cold, and thunder. Hour for hour, the risk on a steamboat is greater, but the speed is safety, or 12 days of danger instead of 24. Our ship was registered 750 tons and weighed perhaps, with all her freight, 1,500 tons. The mainmast, from the deck to the top button, measured 115 feet. The length of the deck, from stem to stem, 155. It is impossible not to personify a ship. Everybody does. In everything they say, she behaves well. She minds her rudder. She swims like a duck. She runs her nose into the water. She looks into a port. Then that wonderful esprit de corps, by which we adopt into our self-love everything we touch, makes us all champions of her sailing qualities. The conscious ship hears all the praise. In one week, she has made 1,467 miles, and now, at night, seems to hear the steamer behind her, which left Boston today at 2. Has mended her speed and is flying before the gray south wind, 11.5 knots the hour. The sea fire shines in her wake, and far around wherever a wave breaks. I read the hour, 9:45 on my watch by this light. Near the equator you can read small print by it, and the mate describes the phosphoric insects, when taken up in a pail, as shaped like a Carolina potato. I find the sea life an acquired taste, like that for tomatoes and olives. The confinement, cold, motion, noise, and odor are not to be dispensed with. The floor of your room is sloped at an angle of 20 or 30 degrees, and I walk every morning with the belief that someone was tipping up my berth. Nobody likes to be treated ignominiously. Upset, shoved against the side of the house, rolled over, suffocated with bilge, nephritis, and stewing oil. We get used to these annoyances at last, but the dread of the sea remains longer. The sea is masculine, a type of active strength. Look what eggshells are drifting all over it, each one, like ours, filled with men in ecstasies of terror, alternating with cockney conceit as the sea is rough or smooth. Is this sad-colored circle an eternal cemetery? In our graveyards, we scoop a pit, but this aggressive water opens mile-wide pits and chasms, and makes a mouthful of a fleet. To the geologist, the sea is the only firmament. The land is in perpetual flux and change, now blown up like a tumor, now sunk in a chasm. And the registered observations of a few hundred years find it in a perpetual tilt, rising and falling. The sea keeps its old level, and it is no wonder that the history of our race is so recent if the roar of the ocean is silencing our traditions. A rising of the sea, such as has been observed, say an inch in a century from east to west on the land, will bury all the town's monuments, bones, and knowledge of mankind, steadily and insensibly. If it is capable of these great and secular mischiefs, it is quite as ready at private and local damage, and of this no landsman seems so fearful as the seaman. Such discomfort and such danger as the narratives of the captain and mate disclose are bad enough as the costly fee we pay for entrance to Europe. But the wonder is always new, that any sane man can be a sailor. And here on the second day of our voyage stepped out a little boy in his shirt sleeves, who had hid himself, whilst the ship was in port, in the bread closet, having no money and wishing to go to England. The sailors have dressed him in Guernsey frock, with a knife in his belt, and he is climbing nimbly about after them. Likes the work first rate, and if the captain will take him, means now to come back again in the ship. The mate avers that this is the history of all sailors. 9 out of 10 are runaway boys, and adds that all of them are sick of the sea, but stay in it out of pride. Jack has a life of risks, incessant abuse, and the worst pay. It is a little better with the mate, and not very much better with the captain. $100 a month is reckoned high pay. If sailors were contented, if they had not resolved again and again not to go to sea any more, I should respect them. Of course, the inconveniences and terrors of the sea are not of any account to those whose minds are preoccupied. The water laws, Arctic frost, the mountain, the mine, only shatter cockneyism. Every noble activity makes room for itself. A great mind is a good sailor, as a great heart is, and the sea is not slow in disclosing inestimable secrets to a good naturalist. It is a good rule in every journey to provide some piece of liberal study to rescue the hours which bad weather, bad company, and taverns steal from the best economist. Classics, which at home are drowsily read, have a strange charm in a country inn, or in the transom of a merchant brig. I remember that some of the happiest and most valuable hours I have owed to books passed many years ago on shipboard. The worst impediment I have found at sea is the want of light in the cabin. We found on board the usual cabin library, Basil Hall, Dumas, Dickens, Bulwer, Balzac, and Sand were our sea gods. Among the passengers, there was some variety of talent and profession. We exchanged our experiences and all learned something. The busiest talk with leisure and convenience at sea, and sometimes a memorable fact turns up which you have long had a vacant niche for, and sees with the joy of a collector. But under the best conditions, a voyage is one of the severest tests to try a man. A college examination is nothing to it. Sea days are long. These lackluster, joyless days which whistled over us. But they were few, only 15, as the captain counted, 16 according to me, reckoned from the time when we left soundings. Our speed was such that the captain drew the line of his course in red ink on his chart for the encouragement or envy of future navigators. It has been said that the King of England would consult his dignity by giving audience to foreign ambassadors in the cabin of a man of war, and I think the white path of an Atlantic ship the right avenue to the palace front of this seafaring people, who for hundreds of years claimed the strict sovereignty of the sea, and exalted a toll in the striking sail from the ships of all other peoples. When their privilege was disputed by the Dutch and other junior marines on the plea that you could never anchor on the same wave or hold property in what was always flowing, the English did not stick to claim the channel or bottom of all the main, quote, as if, said they, we contended for the drops of the sea, and not for its situation, or the bed of those waters. The sea is bounded by His Majesty's empire. As we neared the land, its genius was felt. This was inevitably the British side. In every man's thought arises now a new system, English sentiments, English loves and fears, English history and social modes. Yesterday, every passenger had measured the speed of the ship by watching the bubbles over the ship's bulwarks. Today, instead of bubbles, we measured by Kinsale, Cork, Waterford, and Ardmore. There lay the green shore of Ireland, like some cost of plenty. We could see towns, towers, churches, harvests, but the curse of 800 years we could not discern. A few more pages. Ah. Chapter 3, Land. Alfieri thought Italy and England the only countries worth living in. The former because there nature vindicates her rights and triumphs over the evils inflicted by the governments. The latter because art conquers nature and transforms a rude, ungenial land into a paradise of comfort and plenty. England is a garden. Under an ash-colored sky, the fields have been combed and rolled till they appear to have been finished with a pencil instead of a plow. The solidity of the structures that compose the towns speaks the industry of ages. Nothing is left as it was made. Rivers, hills, valleys, the sea itself feel the hand of a master. The long habitation of a powerful and ingenious race has turned every rood of land to its best use, has found all the capabilities, the arable soil, the quarryable rock, the highways, the byways, the fords, the navigable waters, and the new arts of intercourse meet you everywhere, so that England is a huge phalanstery, where all that man wants is provided within the precinct. Cushioned and comforted in every manner, the traveler rides as on a cannonball, high and low, over rivers and towns, through mountains, in tunnels of 3 or 4 miles at near twice the speed of our trains, and reads quietly the Times newspaper, which by its immense correspondence and reporting seems to have machinized the rest of the world for his occasion. The problem of the traveler landing at Liverpool is why England is England. Why are the elements of that power which the English hold over other nations? If there be one test of national genius universally accepted, it is success. And if there be one successful country in the universe for the last millennium, that country is England. A wise traveler will naturally choose to visit the best of actual nations, and an American has more reasons than another to draw him to Britain. In all that is done or begun by the Americans towards right thinking or practice, we are met by a civilization already settled and overpowering. The culture of the day, the thoughts and aims of men, are English thoughts and aims. A nation considerable for 1,000 years since Egbert, it has, in the last centuries, obtained the ascendant and stamped the knowledge, activity, and power of mankind with its impress. Those who resist it do not feel it or obey it less. The Russian in his snows is aiming to be English. The Turk and Chinese also are making awkward efforts to be English. The practical common sense of modern society, the utilitarian direction which labor, laws, opinion, religion take, is the natural genius of the British mind. The influence of France is a constituent of modern civility, but not enough opposed to the English for the most wholesome effect. The American is only the continuation of the English genius into new conditions, more or less propitious. See what books fill our libraries. Every book we read, every biography, play, romance, in whatever form, is still English history and manners, so that a sensible Englishman once said to me, "As long as you do not grant us copyright, we shall have the teaching of you." But we have the same difficulty in making a social or moral estimate of England that the sheriff finds in drawing a jury to try some cause which has agitated the whole community and on which everybody finds himself an interested party. Officers, jurors, judges have all taken sides. England has inoculated all nations with her civilization, intelligence, and tastes, and to resist the tyranny and prepossession of the British element, a serious man must aid himself by comparing with it the civilizations of the farthest east and west, the old Greek, the Oriental, and much more, the ideal standard, if only by means of the very impatience which English forms are sure to awaken in independent minds. Besides, if we will visit London, the present time is the best, as some signs portend that it has reached its highest point. It is observed that the English interests us a little less within a few years, and hence the impression that the British power has culminated is in solstice or already declining. As soon as you enter England, which with Wales is no larger than the state of Georgia, this little land stretches by an illusion to the dimensions of an empire. Add South Carolina, and you have more than an equivalent for the area of Scotland. The innumerable details, the crowded succession of towns, cities, cathedrals, castles, and great and decorated estates, the number and power of the trades and guilds, the military strength and splendor, the multitudes of rich, of remarkable people, the servants and equipages, all these catching the eye and never allowing it to pause, hide all boundaries of the impression of magnificence and endless wealth. I reply to all the urgencies that refer me to this and that object indispensably to be seen. Yes, to see England well needs 100 years, for what they told me was the merit of Sir John Soanes's museum in London, that it was well packed and well saved, is the merit of England. It is stuffed full in all concerns and crevices with towns, towers, churches, villas, palaces, hospitals, and charity houses. In the history of art, it is a long way from a cromlech to York Minster, yet all the intermediate steps may still be traced in this all-preserving island. The territory has a singular perfection. The climate is warmer by many degrees than it is entitled to be by latitude, neither hot nor cold. There is no hour in the whole year when one cannot work. Here is no winter, but such days as we have in Massachusetts in November, a temperature which makes no exhausting demand on human strength, but allows the attainment of the largest stature. Charles II said, "It invited man abroad more days in the year and more hours in a day than any other country." A day than another country. Then England has all the materials of a working country except wood. The constant rain, a rain with every tide, in some parts of the island, keeps its multitude of rivers full and brings agriculture production up to the highest point. It has plenty of water, of stone, of potter's clay, of coal, of salt, and of iron. The land naturally abounds with game. Immense heaths and downs are paved with quails, grouse, and woodcock, and the shores are animated by water birds. The rivers and the surrounding sea spawn with fish, There are salmon for the rich, and sprats, and herrings for the poor. In the northern lochs, the herring are in innumerable shoals. At one season, the country people say, the lakes contain 1 part water and 2 parts fish. The only drawback on this industrial conveniency is the darkness of its sky. The night and day are too nearly of a color. It strains the eyes to read and to write. Add the coal smoke. In the manufacturing towns, the fine soot or blacks darken the day, give white sheep the color of black sheep, discolor the human saliva, contaminate the air, poison many plants, and corrode the monuments and buildings. The London fog aggravates the distempers of the sky, and sometimes justifies the epigram on the climate by an English wit, quote, in a fine day, looking up a chimney, in a foul day, looking down one. A gentleman in Liverpool told me that he found he could do without a fire in his parlor about 1 day in the year. It is, however, pretended that the enormous consumption of coal in the island is also felt in modifying the general climate. Factitious climate. Factitious position. England resembles a ship in its shape, and if it were one, its best admiral could not have worked it or anchored it in a more judicious or effective position. Sir John Herschel said London is the center of the Terran globe. The shopkeeping nation, to use a shop word, has a good stand. The old Venetians pleased themselves with the flattery that Venice was in 45 degrees midway between the poles and the line, as if it were an imperial centrality. Long of old, the Greeks fancied Delphi the navel of the earth, in their favorite mode of fabling the earth to be an animal. The Jews believed Jerusalem to be the center. I have seen a cratiometric chart designed to show that the city of Philadelphia was in the same thermic belt, and by inference in the same belt of empire as the cities of Athens, Rome, and London. It was drawn by a patriotic Philadelphian, and was examined with pleasure under his showing by the inhabitants of Chestnut Street. But when carried to Charleston, to New Orleans, and to Boston, it somehow failed to convince the ingenious scholars of all those capitals. But England is anchored at the side of Europe, and right in the heart of the modern world. The sea, which, according to Virgil's famous line, divided the poor Britons utterly from the world, proved to be the ring of marriage with all nations. It is not down in the books, it is written only in the geologic strata. That fortunate day when a wave of the German Ocean burst the old isthmus which joined Kent and Cornwall to France, and gave to this fragment of Europe its impregnable sea wall, cutting off an island of 800 miles in length with an irregular breadth reaching to 300 miles. A territory large enough for independence, enriched with every seed of national power, so near that it can see the harvests of the continent, and so far that who would cross the strait must be an expert mariner, ready for tempests. As America, Europe, and Asia lie, these Britons have precisely the best commercial position in the whole planet, and are sure of a market for all the goods they can manufacture. And to make these advantages avail, the river Thames must dig its spacious outlet to the sea from the heart of the kingdom, giving road and landing to innumerable ships, and all the conveniency to trade that a people so skillful and sufficient in economizing waterfront by docks, warehouses, and lighters required. When James I declared his purpose of punishing London by removing his court, the Lord Mayor replied that in removing his royal presence from his lieges, they hoped he would leave them the Thames. In the variety of surface, Britain is a miniature of Europe, having plain, forest, marsh, river, seashore, vines, and Cornwall, caves and Matlock and Derbyshire, delicious landscape in Dovedale, delicious sea view at Tor Bay, Highlands in Scotland, Snowdon in Wales, and Westmoreland and Cumberland a pocket Switzerland, in which the lakes and mountains are on a sufficient scale to fill the eye and touch the imagination. It is a nation conveniently small. Fontenelle thought nature had sometimes a little affection, and there is such an artificial completeness in this nation of artificers, as if there were a design from the beginning to elaborate a bigger Birmingham. Nature held counsel with herself and said, "My Romans are gone. To build my new empire, I will choose a rude race, all masculine and with brutish strength. I will not grudge a competition of the roughest males. Let buffalo gore buffalo, and the pasture to the strongest. For I have work that requires the best will and sinew, sharp and temperate northern breezes shall blow to keep that will alive and alert. The sea shall disjoin the people from others, and knit them to a fierce nationality. I shall give them markets on every side. Long time I will keep them on their feet. By poverty, border wars, seafaring, sea risks, and the stimulus of gain. An island, but not so large, the people not so many as to glut the great markets and depress one another, but proportioned to the size of Europe and the continents. With its fruits and wares and money must its civil influence radiate. It is a singular coincidence to this geographic centrality, the spiritual centrality, which Emanuel Swedenborg ascribes to the people. For the English nation, the best of them are in the center of all Christians, because they have interior intellectual light. This appears conspicuously in the spiritual world. The light they derive from the liberty of speaking and writing, and thereby of thinking. Alright, so this is about 100, and what's 614 minus, actually 621 minus 469. 31 plus 21, 52 plus 100, 152. I just read 20 pages. So that's a little over 10%. 15%. So it's actually kind of a long section here. Land, race, ability, manners, truth, character, cockney, wealth, aristocracy, universities, religion, literature, the times, Stonehenge, personal, result, speech at Manchester. Alright, that's it for now.